All right.
All right, we're live. Yay. It worked
Yay.
again.
It did.
We win twice in a row. Love it.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, you look so beautiful and tanned. You
Thank
spent a week in
you.
Mexico. I wrote an email out to my list today and was just talking about how sometimes getting away from our like current environment is actually really helpful for inspiration and finding new ideas and that sort of thing. So we're going to dive into some of what that's helped you do in the last week, but just wanted to welcome everybody who's joining us live and remind everyone why we're here. This is Dr. Karen, and we are diving into her launch, the launch of her new business, her new offer, and all of the things that kind of go along with it. And this week, in the last kind of couple of weeks, we've been really circling the wagons on something that's like really critically important for everything that's going to happen from now until this business is launched, right? And that is the articulation of the positioning for this program and the messaging behind it and why you're doing it and what you're calling it. So we had kind of come up with a name in the past. And I think what happens with a lot of people is like we had this name and we're sort of there, but then when it really starts to come down to it and you're like, okay, second guessing ourselves. And if there was something that wasn't totally sitting, then you want to go into the process of figuring out, what is this called? And the end result that we're trying to look for is that you come out of this going, yes, this is it. This is it. This is what I'm going with. This is what I'm comfortable with because I've gone through the thought process of better understanding who I'm targeting, really like making sure that I understand what they need and who they are. And then when I come back to my branding, messaging, positioning, I can speak from a place of complete confidence. And that is what helps us sell. So I want to dive into this today. We started this in one place and we've kind of gotten to where we are now. So do you want to like sort of narrate what your thought process has been around branding, position, messaging? Like what are all the things that you had to consider and what are some of the thoughts that you had as you went through this process?
So I was thinking about, and again, what I'm wanting to do is help professionals who are in a position where they are a therapist or even in an educational situation. So I would say that the actual people that I'm wanting to support would be speech pathologists, which is what I currently do, but also I'm expanding to other therapists. And so that could include psychologists, social workers, counselors, occupational therapists, and it could even include people like special education teachers, reading specialists, anybody who is in some kind of a role where they're providing specialized services for kids. So right. Where and I come from the educational side. I do have the medical side as well, but the majority of my experience has been in the school systems, and I have my doctorate in special ed and my director of special education credentials. So this whole concept of leadership really kind of centers around that background there. And so the thing that I was finding with a lot of the clinicians that I work with, just within speech pathology, even though this is way beyond speech pathology, it includes other clinical areas as well, is that I was talking about what we do in therapy, like what do you do when you have a student or a client in front of you? And this is, I'm supporting people who are in the school setting. So like school therapists who in the US were referred to as school service personnel typically. And then I'm also supporting people who might be in a private practice or they might work in a medical setting with kids in a clinic. So it's primarily educational. The majority of the people that I'm supporting are involved in the school systems in some way. And the challenges that they're facing are surrounding just this whole concept of integrating a lot of different services for kids.
Right.
Because a lot of times they feel like they don't have enough time, and they're based on the way that the current system works. in order to support their students, their clients. And it's always this feeling of, wanting to do more, but feeling like they're in the system that is broken. And when I was in that situation myself, what I started to do was kind of just create this, like almost just take on a leadership role, even though I wasn't officially an administrator or supervisor at that point. And so really the whole idea of it is helping people to take on that leadership role wherever they are, whether it be that they want to redesign the role that they're in, or whether they want to use that as a jumping off point to something in the future, and just really empowering them that they can be a leader, they can make a difference. Not dismissing the real issues that are going on. And so where I was struggling with naming was, okay, from a standpoint of actually wanting this to make a difference, I didn't feel like it could be, if I'm just focusing on speech pathologists, that just totally negates the whole idea of integrating all these different professions together. And so I wanted it to be this community of professionals, but it's like, we're kind of in the schools and then we're kind of in medical settings. And so the name that I had come up with actually was an idea that I had done several years ago. I started a Facebook group, one of them that we are streaming in right now, called the Clinical Leadership Mastermind. And so we started with the name Clinical Leadership. And the reason that we started with that is because within the field of speech pathology, and I think that in other areas as well, I would say social workers, psychologists, OTs, PTs, like the other therapists, there is this concept of being an academic or a researcher and being a clinician. So there's these people who are doing research,
Right.
Over here, they're academics. And then there's people who are doing clinical work where they're directly in the trenches working with students and clients. So to a therapist, the idea of a clinical leader, clinical means like you're doing therapy with clients or students. So to me, that made sense. So the word clinical made sense to me. And I think, I thought it hopefully made sense to the people who I'm building this for. So I was hoping that idea of clinical leadership would make sense to them, that they would know what that means. But where I got a little stuck is that clinical sounds like, if you just Google clinical leadership, you'll get a lot of hits for like nursing clinical leadership, which honestly, you could probably lump. There's nurses who work in schools that are part of IEP teams. So actually they could be included in here as well. And so we've got this educational medical, and I just am so much of this is going to be focused on supporting kids who are going through school. So it's really about supporting the professionals that are going to be leaders and change makers for educational reform. So the word clinical, I'm like, it sounds medical. I don't want people just to think this is medical. And so I just really got stuck there, and we were going in circles. And I was like, maybe I want it to be something that's broader, and then it can just be, we describe what it is. We're like, this is the name, and it's something really broad, and then we explain what it is below it. And I was just like, we're like, so because he works for State Farm, and he worked in labs. He doesn't work there now, but at one point he was in the department that has to come up with pitch new ideas and products and services. So we did this whole ideation thing where he's like, tell me all the different things that this is going to do and give me words. And we were just playing around with words. And I sent you the words. And then I was reading leadership books and thinking of other words. And then I was like, Google, like putting words together and Googling to see if podcasts, if there was a podcast or like a blog or a website or a company that had this. Like if I'm like, what about this name? Google it. It's taken. What about this name? Google it. It's taken. Go to the trademark search and see, and all this stuff. And so I was playing around with words like impact and conscious leader and empowering. And the other thing that we played around with which is a conversation that my husband and I had because we're on this Band of Brothers kick because we went to Europe. And so then we were in Normandy, and then we've been like binge watching and reading Band of Brothers and listening to the podcast. The idea of de facto leadership, because there's many. I don't know if you've seen Band of Brothers. There's many situations where the person who was actually in charge wasn't doing their job, so somebody else who was under them had to take over and like really be the de facto leader and the person who kind of like took over. And eventually both of those people who we talked about did end up getting promoted. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. Some people consciously choose to stay where they are because they like it. They just want it to be a good situation. So we played around with the word de facto and self-determined, and we really wanted to embrace this idea of, another word was emerging leader. And the thing I didn't like about that is that in the clinical world, sometimes when you say something is emerging, it sounds like a beginner. And I want people to feel like, like you're qualified. You're qualified to do this now. So yeah, like it's funny because I'm a language person and like,
but listen,
word, like what's the word? So we came around, and the name that we decided on was School of Clinical Leadership, just because I like the ring to it. I like the word school in there. And we just went back to clinical leadership because I think that a lot of people who are in those roles do understand what that means. And I think that if I am clear in what I'm saying and just all of my other content surrounding this whole thing, that people will know what it is.
Yes. So I want to stop you there because that is the important piece here, right? How this relates, I am sure that there are people who are watching who are like, yeah, I feel you, right? Because right now I find the naming process to be really difficult. And I am not a fluffy person. I don't like cutesy. And for me, it always comes back to being clear. And so this process that you've gone through, where you've ended up, is actually not too dissimilar from where you started, but you had to go through this process of exploration to find your edges, like to feel like, what would it feel like to have something like conscious leader or something a little bit more, ethereal. And at the end of the day, where you ended up was clear, concise, relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And you're happy, right? And that is what's most important, is that we get to a place where you're like, yes, I've done this process. I haven't just like picked something out of, when I first worked for the first software startup I worked for, literally we did not have a name for our product, and we were going to do like a presentation the next day. And we're like, what are we going to call this thing? And we literally went to the dictionary and we picked out the first word that we put our name or our finger on. And we just made a story around it. And the word was zebu. We're like, what does that mean? And like, it doesn't matter, right? But a zebu is a Hindu holy, like a blessed cow. And so we told the story. We named it Zebu because everybody would see our product and say, holy cow, that's amazing, right? So my philosophy is that what's important about your name is that your people who you're trying to reach will understand it. Mm-hmm. They will be able to very clearly say, yes, this is for me. This pertains to me. And so the idea that it was too literally clinical, medical, was the starting point of this journey. But what you came back to is like, this is a generally understood term.
Yeah.
And so we have a tendency to get caught up in like our vernacular inside of our industry, and we have the curse of the expert because we know too much. I think when we're naming, I think when we're branding, it's really hard for a business owner to do because they are too close to their business. They are too invested in their business, and they overthink, like so at the end of the day, we do have to come back to something that's clear, concise, and where you can get creative is in all of the marketing and the branding and the messaging around it. So that's, I think, what our next step is going to be, is like, okay, how can we use the subtext and how can we use our copy to really clearly weed out the people who this is not for and give them more context and like do the heart punch, gut punch work inside of our copy. You needed to go through this process. You needed to get to something you were like committed to and invested in, and you needed to go through this thought process. But this is not unique to Karen. I think everybody does this. So what do you think was most helpful in finally arriving at what you did?
What was most helpful? So I think that when you do some kind of a brainstorm and come up with a bunch of word vomit, I think it's good to keep that because sometimes you can keep it later and you can use it. So I actually haven't. That was one of my assignments this week, was to put that somewhere to use those words. So I have to do that. That was helpful. It was helpful in even though the name is basically the same or very similar to what it was really good to just really think about what it's about and who it's for, because the idea of naming and thinking about like what is this thing just helped me get a little clearer on what the what's the word, the values. Again, the idea of de facto leadership really came out there. And it was just sort of like, okay, this is random. So how things just kind of, I don't know, maybe they line up, or maybe you just, confirmation bias or whatever. But again, we went to Europe. We're reading, started reading Band of Brothers, and my husband, before we went on our trip, ordered. So there's the Band of Brothers book, and then there's Dick Winters and the other guys. They all have books. And so he ordered the books, and they came in like literally as we're driving away to go to the airport, like the Amazon or the UPS or whatever, wherever you order them from, came. He's like, oh, they're here. We can take them with. And I didn't even realize, I thought I was just reading about the, just like the experience, but it's actually like really the Dick Winters book is about leadership. Like he has at the very end of the book, like rules for leadership. This is how I did, all of the things. And so it was just weird timing. And so I think just the process of sort of just floating around with like whatever content I felt compelled to pick up was helpful. And it was just weird timing, and I think, okay, so you asked me what was the most helpful part of the process and what helped me land where I landed. What was the question again? Like what was the most helpful part that helped me to just figure out what it was. I think, I think the thing that I came away with was that it might not matter that much. I think that's really what I came away with, because there's some people who have programs where it's just a word, like your software company, for example. And so I was like, I think I just got to the point where it was like, I just need to pick something so I can move on to thinking about something else, and it's good enough. And it's fine. I do think that the original, we were just going to call it the Clinical Leadership Program. And I do think that sounded a little more generic. It didn't really sound like a thing. And so I do like School of Clinical Leadership better. It sounds more like a community.
Here's what I think about this process is that just like with a lot of other things, I think that when we have something to respond to, that's when we start to better define our edges, right? And when you had something to respond to that were, the options that you were sending to me, you were able to tap into how those made you feel. Yeah. And whereas the process of trying to just pull new ideas out of the air is really tough. Like that's actually really, really difficult. And like naming is a whole art form in itself. But I agree with you that we got to the point where I think everybody gets to, where it's not so critical what we're calling this thing, but more so that we are able to speak in long form very clearly about who this is for. And so maybe this is a good sort of segue into a little bit more of what's happened in the last week. And this is also, I think, quite relatable to other business owners, is that when you start talking about this thing, right? You start talking about this upcoming program, you're going to get feedback. You're going to get feedback from your audience, from people who are listening. And there's a whole other dialogue and discussion around what that feedback means to you, what you do with it, and how you incorporate that into the decisions you're making around how you're messaging things going forward. So you did get some of that feedback. You got some responses. And there's one of two things we can do when we get these kinds of, like this kind of dialogue. To me, it's gold, whether it's positive, negative, or anything. It's a way for you to make decisions about what you say going forward. So you had that feedback, and you could either have decided that this feedback is coming from someone who is not in the mindset or the frame of mind, or is just not the right fit for this program, which is totally fine. Doesn't mean they're good or bad or anything. Right. Or you could have looked at this and you could have said, interesting. Now I have some more real world information that's going to help me better craft my messaging. So I like that you've gone out already and you've like taken imperfect action. You've thrown this idea out there and you've said, okay, let's see what comes back. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So there's one thing that I learned a while back. Forget the phrase where it's like, focus on the data, not the drama. I do think that it's hard to tell at the very beginning when you don't have a lot of data. You're just sort of putting things out there. You do kind of have to just look at the qualitative feedback that you're getting as far as what people are saying. I think ultimately, once you get going with things and are people signing up for things? Are people clicking and reading? There are some actual hard numbers that you can look at that are very telling. And if you get to that point and somebody doesn't like it, but lots of other people do, this was Seth Godin who said this, I think. He said something like, when somebody tells you that they don't like something or that you're, like whatever, it's like they're saying, change this thing that you said or stop doing this thing that you're doing. By them telling you that they want you to trying to police you, I guess. It's like they're taking it away from those other people who like it. So I think we have to be very careful to not freak out. So that's one thing. I do like to kind of look at things objectively, like how are my numbers looking? And at the very beginning, we're just kind of looking at engagement, clicks and opens and, those kinds of things. But I think the other thing is that I wanted to know, it's not a matter of do people it's not a matter of people like it or not, or it's not a matter of is everybody happy and does everybody like it? It's am I being clear in what I'm wanting to say? Because if I'm clear in what I want to say and what I know to be true, if they don't like it and maybe they don't believe that it's true, or they were triggered by it for some reason, I'm not going to go back on what I know to be true and what I believe is going to be beneficial based on my experience just because somebody doesn't like it. But where I would be more open to changing it is if they're saying something and triggered or whatever, and I didn't come across the way that I wanted to, and my point didn't come across clearly. So that, I think that's what's really the most important to me right now, is being clear and being clear myself, and then communicating clearly to other people so that they can decide if it's for them or not. Because and I think that some of my programs in the past, when I've tried to do things similar to this particular one and it didn't, if things didn't stick as well, it's not that it was bad and people were upset. It's that people were confused. I don't
Such
You
a
know,
good point. Yeah.
it's like, here's people, like they're on this fence and they don't know what to do. And so in order to be able to help them, you have to get them to take action. And that means you have to inspire some emotional response in them, which means that you give them like the heart punch, like, oh my gosh, that's for me. You're right. Like they're inspired to do something and then they go over here, or they go the other way and you piss them off.
Yeah.
So like, I just want them to get off the fence. And in the past, I like what I see as I don't want to say a failure, but where I see as like I swung and I missed is where it's like crickets. Crickets is worse than a negative triggered
Yeah.
response.
Yeah.
So that's the way I look at it. And yeah, and I think that it's always good to know, to have someone say like, you know, this is what I think. And then you can kind of look at it and say like, well, are they not reading what I actually said? And is that why they're upset? To through and read my other thing that I linked them to that explained it more. Like there's that as well. So I think you kind of have to just look at it. I think you should always look at it. It doesn't mean that your conclusion is I'm changing what I'm saying. It might, if you realize, oh wait, wow, they thought I meant this, and you know, I didn't.
But it's all good information, right? And I think this is one of the mistakes people make, is they try to get everything right first. And you are not going to get you're never going to get everything right, but you're not going to get closer to that really crisp messaging until you start trying. And your first attempt is going to be like, all right, I'm 60%, right? Like I'm kind of 60% there. I'm starting to like feel these things out. What I hear back from people, it's not good or bad. What it is it's more information. And so you can look at every scenario of every response that you get and say, all right, so let me take a read of this particular scenario. Who is this? What's their context? What were they hearing? That's really good information. What they heard from me was X, Y, and Z. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're jaded or they have the wrong perspective or something like that. It might mean that I wasn't clear in my communication down here, and I didn't give them enough to want to keep reading, right? So there's all this stuff. It's all good information. And I think this is an important lesson for any business owner that's going through this process, is like, you've got to get your shitty first draft out there. You've got to like just start trying. And the trying is where the real gold is. Because if you, like I said, like you said, crickets is about the worst thing that you can have, because you don't get any information back. And so, you know, this process that you're going through right now, the next thing you send out will be more information. And the next thing you send out is more information. And it tells great stories about where people are at in their own thinking. So therefore, what you're going to talk about in the future can address that. So I think this is all gold. And we have to put aside our egos, and we have to put aside our, you know, the emotion behind the responses you might get, and be able to look at them as data.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that you're going to continue to get, you know, that kind of feedback. And the best thing you can do is go and engage, right? Mm-hmm. Well, within reason, right? If this is just like, if somebody were to come to you with like guns blazing and there was just nothing productive, then fine. But I think every one of these are an opportunity for engagement, asking more questions. Mm-hmm. Everything about selling, marketing is about how well and how intimately you know the people you're selling to. So here's a segue. Mm-hmm. In the frame of messaging and positioning and copywriting and what we're starting to tell people, you are now starting to bleed into a new audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Your audience is going from this to this. And so this is starting to mean that the things you've talked about before, some of the messaging you've had before, your comfort levels with going and having these conversations are going to start being pushed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, there's certain activities that I just didn't do.
Yeah.
Because it was within the context of how things worked, it just didn't, they were uncomfortable and it didn't even make sense. Like to me, it wasn't worth it to do those things, if because it wasn't going to make that much difference. And now because there's a pivot, it actually does now. So the strategies change.
Yeah, it does. And I think the conversations that you're going to be having are going to start to change a little bit, which is like part of the process.
Totally.
And this is evolution. So what are some of the things that you are going to be doing now that are different from what you were doing in the past?
Well, so from a strategy standpoint, I am going to keep some stuff because it is still working, and it actually is going to, the things that I'm doing now, I think will work even better.
Yeah.
I think I'll get even more mileage. One of my primary strategies has been Facebook ads, and I have a very small market, and they're getting very harder and harder to target on Facebook because of all the changes with the algorithm. And a lot of the Facebook ads people that I've talked to have been like, you can't scale this, it's too small. The other thing that is like, you're not, there's a whole conversation there. I won't go down that rabbit hole. I actually did find a very good Facebook ads person that I'm very happy with that was able to take that off my plate because it was sucking all of my time, all of my energy, and I couldn't build this. So that was a huge relief to find somebody there. But that means that the way that I target the targeting, like my actual targeting in the ads dashboard, is going to be way different.
Yeah.
And I've been able to make Facebook and Instagram ads work pretty well for me. But the other platforms have been a challenge because of the targeting thing, like Google and YouTube. And I think that there's more potential there for that. But in the meantime, the other thing that I haven't done a lot of is collaborations because, I would get asked to speak somewhere and it's like, okay, I've got to travel and I've got to do this and that. And like, it's just sort of a different framework. And so I think that if when you're talking to a different pool of people, the expectations become different. So I am going to be way more focused on, like I've got my ads, I've got my email marketing going. That's worked for me. And I do stuff on social media, even though that's not like my biggest strength. Email marketing is more so, but I'm definitely going to be focusing more on the networking and the outreach than I ever had, because that's not really something I've done a lot of because it was so easy to just do a Facebook ad, and not have to do that. And I've done some collaborations here or there, but nothing big and nothing that really amplified things that much, but I also wasn't that consistent with it. So just the idea, like just the pool of people and opportunities has expanded from the stuff I'm already doing with the ads, but then also from a networking standpoint, because there's so many different people when you think about, integrated service delivery, aside from, just SLPs, even though I will still want to be working with SLPs as well. It just opens the door. And honestly, we're still kind of figuring out what that looks like. That's a little fuzzy for me. So that's still pretty uncomfortable. But there's lots we can do with that now that it's a little different because
I want to talk about that for a sec, because like you said, in your previous business model, I mean, you were primarily relying on ads and Facebook ads and some social media and that sort of thing. And there wasn't a lot of that sort of collaboration, outreach, visibility stuff going on. And part of the reason behind that was because it wasn't really clear the context in which you were going to do it.
Yeah.
And what's become clear and obvious with this new program is that there is much more of a context, and there is a vehicle, like a container with which to have those conversations. And it was interesting for me to hear you say, I'm happy to do that kind of stuff, but I just need, like, I need the context. And I was like, that's so true. That's like really true from even other, I think a lot of people say, I'm an introvert, I don't like that kind of stuff, and so I can't do it because I'm an introvert. But I think really what the problem is that they don't know what the context of that sort of collaboration is going to be. And so when that becomes clear, it becomes easier to go out and start having those conversations. And I think that's a really important point to make, because in our marketing, you can only do so much without building relationships in terms of getting new audiences in, right? You can rely on ads, but you have to, as you know, there's a lot of investment in figuring out, do I have an ads capable product to sell? Do I have like the audience, and so on and so forth. So I think this whole finding a new audience and finding new clients is very much tied to how I'm showing up from a visibility perspective. And if showing up from a visibility perspective is hard, it's likely because we haven't defined the context in which to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always say within the therapy world, we call it scaffolding. Like you need some sort of like structure and support around what you're doing. And that's always how I've been. If I'm like I think some people might just naturally want to chit chat with people and BS with them. Like I don't do that. I don't, I see all these people collaborating and doing all these things, and it's like, I would love to do that, but I don't even know where to start. And so this is the process of figuring out how that looks so that I can start doing that. And I think I'm pretty antsy to get going on that. I want to figure that out, but we've got a lot of work to do to get there.
Okay. So what's primary on your plate now for the next week?
Well, I today got a lot of my pre-launch content done. So the emails and social media posts that I'm sending out. And then I've got a couple that I need to write that, are going to kind of like, I have to do them as I go. So, but yeah, I'm good until, so now I need to start thinking about what the actual launch experience is going to look like so that I can start inviting people to that. I have to figure out what it's called. I need to figure out like what it is, and then start creating the materials that are going to invite people into that. So the social media posts, the marketing emails, I have to talk to my ads person to figure out what our strategy is going to be there to get the word out there. And then also I have to figure out the follow-up after, what that's going to look like, what information and questions and objections people are going to have after that. And so I'm going to have to figure out that. So I'm kind of through pre-launch planning, or at least like it's still happening, but it's scheduled out and written and planned. And now I'm starting to transition to the actual launch planning. And which means I also, in the back of my mind, have to think about what the onboarding is going to look like when people start to come in.
Yeah.
So I have to figure that out. And so those are kind of the main things on my plate right now.
So we're doing a launch to an evergreen product, right?
Yes.
And this is an interesting model, and I have a few clients that are doing the same thing. But a launch is like kind of a kickoff, but it's almost a little bit more of a promotion, right? It's a reason to have a conversation about what you are doing. And so a launch has a lot of moving parts, and it is quite complex, and there's a lot going on. And even for like a very simple launch, there's, I did a launch plan for my client and my other client, and she was just like, what? Because she'd never done this in a more formal capacity. And so what we're doing is we're starting a conversation, right? We're starting a conversation with your audience, but there's like gazillions of emails and social posts, and we try to scaffold all of that by leveraging kind of what you've created from an email perspective, and that becomes social and so on. But what's interesting to me is always the launch event, because I think there's so much room to be creative
Yeah.
And in the past, in the online business model, there's always been this idea of like a teaching moment or a webinar, or like I'm the guru or I'm the teacher. And we're trying to break away from that model a little bit and do something a little bit more creative. So you're kind of chewing on this idea and you're innovating a little bit around this idea. And hopefully by the time we talk next week, it'll be a lot more fully thought out. But what are some of your initial thoughts, and why did we come to that?
So I want the launch to be like the program. I would say that for my current signature course, it is more of a traditional course. So the thing that I use to enroll people in my current, well, not my current, I have more than one course, but like my signature main course is more of a teaching. It's a webinar. And so, but that's like what the course is like. So it makes sense because it's congruent with the experience that they're going to get when they sign up for the course. It's a self-led course. There's a specific beginning and end period. There is a Q&A, but a lot of times it's asynchronous. I do show up live some of the time, but again, it's like the format and the experience is similar to what they're signing up for. So I want this launch to be like that too. Right. So I didn't want to do something that was going to be just lecture and maybe ask some questions, which, like that can work for some adult learners, but this material is different because it's not tactical. And I think you can teach the tactical stuff in that more traditional format with just a little bit of a community around it. But this is just it's going to be, I want it to be more of an experience and not just a lecture. So that's the whole thing that I am trying to figure out how to facilitate. Because for a number of reasons, I think that it needs to be a very active process because it's more abstract. It's more values based. It's more about teaching people how to think differently and teaching people a process for thinking through things and like kind of getting to that flow. So it's very dynamic.
Yeah.
So the launch needs to be dynamic too. And I eventually do want this to be something that people can kind of come into. At this point, I'm not planning on having it where it's closed enrollment, where it's only enrollment is only open at a couple times a year. So I do want to have a way that this could be something that I could kind of keep going. So what I'm probably going to do is, some live roundtable discussions in the Clinical Leadership Mastermind Facebook group and some kind of an interactive, similar to a challenge, but not exactly a challenge. Because people sometimes do challenge launches where it's like, drink a smoothie every day for 7 days, or do this exercise thing, and then report back to the group. And so this is going to be similar to that, but there's going to be more of a discussion around it.
Yeah.
So it has it has challenge vibes to it. I think anybody who's in the entrepreneurial space will know what that means. If you're not, then you won't know what challenge launch means.
I think calling it a challenge almost like doesn't give it enough credit. I think what you're doing is you're stimulating new thought and you're demonstrating to people that they can take actions right now that put them in that new sort of frame of mind and help them realize that these things are possible. Because I think that your audience is in a place where they may not believe that change is possible, and they may not believe that they can feel more empowered and they can be more empowered. So I think that this is actually a really critical exercise. And even if people never join the program, if they went through whatever we're going to call this thing, this launch event, they can come away with some real value.
Yeah. So basically, I'm going to do something live, some kind of a live discussion, live facilitation, roundtable discussions. But then those Facebook Lives, those videos are going to be up there. So people can come in and watch the video after the fact and still participate in it. And it's a Facebook group they can comment and do the experience, and they can interact with me, or maybe somebody else who ends up being on my team. Like they can participate in the process after this initial promotion, so it can continue to be like that afterwards. It can continue to be available for people.
That's right.
Yeah.
It becomes an asset in your business.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to wrap up here because I know that you've got a sort of a hard stop. Yeah. But what I'd really love to hear from the folks who are watching, whether you're watching live or you're watching kind of down the road, the recorded session, what are some of the questions that you have for Karen? And what are some of the experiences you've had going through the same kind of process where we're trying to collect all of the data. We're trying to collect all of the feedback points that funnel into this building and evolving positioning and messaging. Because I don't think this stops once you launch. I think setting the expectation that this continues to grow and evolve post-launch and as you build the program. I would love to hear from the folks who are watching and hear about your experiences building your own messaging and positioning and branding for your offers, and what were some of the helpful things that you went through to get to a place where you were really comfortable and happy with what you came up with. Yeah. Okay. So next week, we can hopefully sit down and talk about what the live event is going to be. Mm-hmm. And any of the new challenges or new thoughts that have come up. And I'm sure that over the course of the next week, we're going to have plenty of good discussions. Is there anything else that you wanted to sort of leave the viewers with today?
No, I'm just noticing how long it takes me to answer questions, which I already knew. But yeah, I mean, I guess this is just kind of the process of messaging, or the process of getting your thoughts clear, is that I just take me a while talking through things and going back and forth, and the dialogue has been a tremendous help in not just naming, but the whole process. And I just really was not getting that before. When I create something, I just has to be something that obviously something I really believe in. I mean, most people say that when they make something, but it has to be something that I need, so it has to be as much for me as it is for the people that I'm serving. And I just, I'm not the kind of person that can sell something that I wouldn't want to personally invest in, or that I wouldn't have wanted to personally invest in at some point. And I just really felt like, and I've been feeling this last year, that a lot of the groups and the support that I've been getting, it's been kind of like, it's not efficient. It doesn't allow you to really pull things out, where it's like, you got to ask your question really quickly and you don't even know what your question is. You need to just kind of stew on things. And so I think that talking that out, and having really, like sometimes you have to just start the process for your ideas to come out. And that's been my experience with writing too, like even with academic writing and things like that. And I was just getting stuck before because I was just sort of ruminating by myself and sort of in these Facebook groups where people would just not really have the patience to go back and forth with dialogue and questions. And so that's the kind of thing that I want to create for people. And I want it to be about sharing information, but also about facilitating dialogue and but not in a guru-y coaching weird.
No, that's not
whatever, how people. There's a lot of I also didn't want the guru coaching call format either.
Well, and that just comes back to everything I talk about with my clients too, is that whatever you're building has to be perfectly aligned with who you are. For some people, that model is what they want and what they want to build. And that there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But you have to build something that for you was exciting and that felt an integrity. And you are in there as a learner as well, alongside, your clients, and you become part of that community.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. Okay. Well, let's shut her down, and I'm excited to see what you come back with next week. I'm sure we'll be talking again in an hour, but I love your take on this. I love documenting the process. I love hearing your own like perceptions and analysis of what you're going through, because I think there's so many other people that can relate, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All
We'll see
right.
everybody next week.
See you next week.
Bye.